consider the first shots of the American Revolution, the battles of Lexington and Concord. I don't know that we would consider them the first military battles of the war, but they're the first shots. And you guys have probably heard the story of Paul Revere riding through the countryside and saying, "The British are coming, the British are coming." This is when that happened, because the British soldiers were in the port in Boston Harbor, basically. The Patriots, the Americans, were sort of waiting to see what they were going to do, watching them very carefully. And at one point, a bunch of them did disembark from their ships, did start to come inland. And what they were doing was going inland to secure some weapons that were further inland. And Paul Revere lit a lamp in Christ Church to signal to everyone that they were moving inland. And at the first place, the first town that a bunch of Americans met them and fought with them and tried to stop them was Lexington. And at that point, the Americans couldn't really stop them. They fought with them, but basically the British won that battle at Lexington. And the Americans kind of dispersed and let the British keep marching westward. The next town that they came to was Concord. And amazingly and surprisingly to both sides, at Concord, the Americans won. When they fought there, the Americans beat these British soldiers, who of course were very well trained and very well supplied and had great weapons. But at that second day of fighting, on April 19th, there were 273 British casualties and only 95 American. So that's pretty stunning. And that was a huge, shot in the arm for the Americans. But I think that what's even more surprising and impressive than that is that by the evening of the next day, get this, guys, by the evening of the next day, 20,000 New England guys, farmers, regular Joe Sixpacks, as I call them, had descended on Boston, ready to fight, ready to do whatever their leader, who would be George Washington, told them to do. And that's kind of cool, because if you think about it, I always tell my students, if something bad happened in Atlanta today, could we get 20,000 guys to descend at the Georgia Dome by tomorrow night to fight, ready to sign their life away for however long it took to defend Georgia? Probably we could. But, it would be an effort, I think, and we'd probably use Facebook and email and the local news and the radio and all that. How did they get 20,000 guys in 24 hours with none of that? Well, they did because these guys were waiting on the edge of their seat, and word traveled like wildfire. So there are these amazing stories in these New England towns of these men who, and boys, really boys too, who just were waiting for word. Send us, we'll go. And when they got word, they just dropped whatever they had. They left their tools in the middle of the farm and the field, and they just went. And they didn't leave lengthy letters of instruction for their wives, and they just marched off. That we call them the Minutemen. They went in a minute. And there are these really heartwarming stories about these New England towns where they gave them blankets, and they gave them food, and they gave them all the different supplies that they needed because they had just marched off with nothing. And this is also really cool. These are the men, really enthusiastic, but totally unprepared, that George Washington is going to turn into the military power, if we can even call them that, that's going to beat England. That's going to beat the most powerful empire in the whole world, the most professional army in the whole world. How's he going to do that? How can George Washington do that? And he does. We already know the end of the story. He beats them. So that's kind of awesome. Well, I'm going to give you a little end of the story now. He's going to do it because he sticks with them and because they don't give up, and they just keep fighting, and they may win many fewer battles than England's going to win, but they keep fighting, and they keep fighting, and they're going to kind of wear England out. But it's kind of amazing that he's going to take this ragtag group of farmers with guns used to kill, turkeys in the backyard, and he's going to beat England. And also the French are going to be enormously helpful, which we're going to talk about too. So I don't want to leave them out either. All right. So, by the way, this lecture and this PowerPoint also mentions a document called Common Sense. So before we leave this lecture behind, I also do want to mention Common Sense to you guys, which you may have heard of before. It was written by Thomas Paine, and it was published in 1776. And this also really helped the revolutionary cause. I've been talking in the lectures lately about the different things that helped the revolutionary cause. Well, Common Sense really did. I tend to think that Thomas Paine was sort of a Jon Stewart of the 18th century. If you guys ever watched Jon Stewart on the Comedy Channel, Thomas Paine was like him in the sense that he used comedy, and he was very well informed, and he knew his history, and he knew his Bible, and he knew literature, and what he used all of that knowledge for, in the case of Thomas Paine, was to argue, okay, this is important, to argue that the colonies should separate from England. He made fun, so with the humor part, he made fun of England, he made fun of the monarchy, he used the Bible, so if you're someone who reads the Bible, you could find in this document, this pamphlet, good biblical reasoning for why England should separate. If you were an Enlightenment person who really got into the Enlightenment, he said, come on, the Enlightenment rejects the divine right of kings, the Enlightenment, talks about the laws of reason. Our revolution is totally all about that. And he had this other part that I really think is kind of a mind bender, and I like the mind benders. He said, the mother country is a parasite on colonial wealth and a predator on colonial liberties. And I think that's really neat because we tend to think about colonies as depending on their mother country, I think, usually. But he turned it around and he said, no, the mother country is the parasite and the predator. And I think that's really interesting. So this document, Common Sense, was really important, and I would encourage you guys to be aware of that. All right. The reaction from Great Britain, there's a slide about that. We've kind of talked about that, particularly as it related to the merchants who were so mad at London for the taxation that resulted in the non-importation movement. Who was responsible for this war, I think we can sort of skip over that. I think we've talked about things around that, which is adequate. And then finally, the last piece and the last slide, what would the war mean for others? White women, slaves, and loyalists. For white women, we've talked about that already, in that we've looked at how white women were really drawn into the revolution, and they were drawn into politics, and they were told, you have a really important role to play, particularly with the non-importation movement. Could the resistance really have worked without women's participation? I don't know. And I think probably not. The second part that has to do with white women in this revolution that I want you to know about is he has to do with this concept of republicanism that I talked about before. Because remember how I emphasized that this idea that you would let regular guys vote and have a say in their political future and who their leaders were, and I emphasized to you that this was an experiment and this was radical, and a lot of leaders at the time in America and in England and Europe thought, I don't know if you can trust these regular guys who aren't very well educated. who don't come from wealthy families, can you really give them an equal vote to